All right.
Thanks for having Josh here this evening.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Josh is just fun to watch. All right. Well, we're in Matthew 27, and we're going to look at verse 27. As I was talking to Brett earlier today, we're going to be out of Matthew before we know it. We're coming to the middle portion of Matthew 27, and then Matthew 28, and that'll be it. We need to start praying about where we're going to go, which book of the Bible we're going to be looking at after this. So I'd appreciate it if you'd be in prayer with me about that. And it's been amazing what we've studied up to this point in time, and I believe it'll continue to be that way. So looking at Matthew 27, verse 27, we're going to read all the way down to verse 37. So if you'll follow along with me. Then the soldiers of the governor took Jesus into the praetorium and gathered the whole Roman cohort around him. They stripped him and put a scarlet robe on him, and after twisting together a crown of thorns, they put it on his head and a reed in his right hand. They knelt down before him and mocked him, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews!" They spat on him and took the reed and began to beat him on the head. After they had mocked him, they took the scarlet robe off him and put his own garment back on him, and led him away to crucify him. As they were coming out, they found a man of Cyrene named Simon, whom they pressed into service to bear his cross. And when they came to a place called Golgotha, which means place of a skull, they gave him wine to drink mixed with gall, and after tasting it, he was unwilling to drink. And when they had crucified him, they divided up his garments among themselves by casting lots, and sitting down, they began to keep watch over him there. And above his head, they put up the charge against him, which read, "This is Jesus, the King of the Jews." Actually, I want to read a little further. I'm sorry. At that time, two robbers were crucified with him, one on the right and one on the left, and those passing by were hurling abuse at him, wagging their heads and saying, "You're going to destroy the temple. You who are going to destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days, save yourself. If you are the Son of God, come down from the cross." In the same way, the chief priests also, along with the scribes and elders, were mocking him and saying, "He saved others, he cannot save himself. He is the King of Israel. Let him come down now from the cross, and we will believe in him. He trusts in God. Let God rescue him, if he delights in him, for he said, I am the Son of God." I am the Son of God. The robbers who had been crucified with him were also insulting him with the same words. All right, we'll stop right there. Now, we are going to only go to verse 37 tonight, but I wanted to read all of that portion of Scripture, because in this, what we're seeing as we look at this laid out for us by Matthew, if you read John's account of the gospel, which we're going to read portions of it tonight, but John seems to project the crucifixion of Jesus Christ from the view of God, and we see the love and the mercies of God being demonstrated in the work of Christ on the cross, and it's just the dominant theme of John. But when we read Matthew's account of the crucifixion, it's as though it's from the viewpoint of those that are doing the crucifying, and the emphasis seems to be placed more on the wickedness of the crucifixion, the wickedness of these men that are carrying out this execution. Now you take note of this, that Jesus Christ is the Lamb of God. Lambs were to be sacrificed. That was the reason and purpose that they were utilized in worship there in Israel, as a sacrifice for God. And as a covering for sin, Jesus is the Lamb that is slain. And recognize this, that during the Old Testament time, in the period in which the sacrifices were given and mandated by God, there was no way or any indication that those lambs or any other animal that was used in sacrifice were tormented or mistreated in any way. But basically they were treated with humane aspects. Even their death would have been quick, as they would bleed out, and as painless as it possibly could be, even though I'm not going to say it was a painless death even at that point in time. But it was not a cruel death. It was not a malicious death. It was not a sadistic type of dying. For Jesus to take the sins of the world, it did not require him to go through the malicious sadism that was being demonstrated on him by these that are carrying out the crucifixion. And we know that God is there. We know that this is a decree that God has laid from the foundations of the world, that Christ would die as the sacrifice for sin. But what we're seeing here is the evidence that though God is the author of this, yet it is man carrying it out. And in fact, if you look in Acts chapter 2, when Peter is preaching to those people that have gathered there on the day of Pentecost, he says in verse 22, in Acts chapter 2, "Men of Israel, listen to these words. Jesus the Nazarene, a man attested to you by God with miracles and wonders and signs which God performed through him in your midst, just as you yourself know. This man delivered over by the predetermined plan and foreknowledge of God." This was the predetermined plan, the will of God. Jesus went to Gethsemane the night before his crucifixion, and he wept, he cried, he sweat great drops of blood, and he pleaded with God, "If there be any other way, let this cup pass from me, but nevertheless, not my will, but thy will be done." And he fully and completely brought his will into submission to the Father's will. And though it appears that he is wavering at that point in time, as he is travailing in prayer, crying with loud cries, as is recorded for us in Hebrews chapter 5, yet from the moment that he gets up and he goes to meet those to arrest him, he is never without his composure, never without his resolve. In fact, during the entire trial and all the things that we see, Jesus maintains his perfect perspective and commitment to go to the cross. He never utters anything in his own defense. He never cries out for mercy, either at the hands of those that are the perpetrators of this or from God himself. He is completely committed to fulfilling the will of the Father. And so it says that he was, in verse 23, this man delivered over by the predetermined plan and foreknowledge of God, yet it says, you nailed to the cross by the hands of godless men and put him to death. And even though it was God's predetermined plan and in his foreknowledge, yet he holds them accountable. He holds all mankind accountable. He says, you nailed him to the cross by the hands of godless. King James Version says wicked men. Wicked men. Men without God did this. Men that shows no mercy, shows no compassion, shows no grace. As we go through these passages of Scripture, all of these that I've read, not just the ones we study tonight, but we'll come back and study further next week, we're going to see that there were 4 different groups of evil that are represented here in this passage in Matthew. And the first one we're going to study tonight, that first group is the ignorant wicked. These were the Romans, the Roman cohort that is surrounding him. And as he is put in their hands, no longer will the angels be there to protect him. No longer will they keep him from dashing his foot against a stone. They will be helpless as they watch Jesus being manhandled and mistreated and abused and mocked and ridiculed and pain inflicted upon him by those Roman soldiers. They're referred to here as the ignorant wicked. The second group will be the knowing wicked, those who knew that he was Christ, and yet they still perpetrated their evil upon him. The fickle wicked, the crowds, the passerbyers, that though they don't really have a part to play in either his arrest or his trial, yet they take and they join in with the crowds as they all in unison mock and ridicule Christ while he is there on the cross. And then finally, the religious wicked, and that's the greatest wicked of all. So there are four groups that we're going to be looking at. These are covered well in your study guide tonight. I will not be going through your study guide by verbatim and point by point. I will leave that up to you. This is a great guide to go through. It covers much more than I will share with you tonight. But I'm going to take certain high points from this, and I'm going to explain them in this study that we have tonight. So going back to the 27th verse in Matthew 27, it says, "Then the soldiers of the governor took Jesus into the praetorium and gathered the whole Roman cohort around him." Now, the cohort, it's interesting because cohort is representative of a number. About 600 would be the Roman cohort. These were not the ones that were stationed there at Fort Antonio. These are most likely that group of soldiers that would accompany Pilate everywhere he would travel in his travels there in Palestine. His headquarters were in Caesarea to the north, along the Mediterranean. That was where Pilate was headquartered. He would only come to Jerusalem at various times of the year for various purposes. So he had a praetorium, he had a court, he had a council that was there for him, but that was not his predominant home. He didn't like being in Jerusalem. It wasn't as nice and good a place, hospitable a place as Caesarea would be, but he didn't like it because it was the heart of the Jewish society and religion. And Fort Antonio, as you know, was built right next to the temple. And all the issues that Pilate had with the Jews seemed to take place or have originated there in the past, there in Jerusalem. So he doesn't enjoy his business there, but he has to be there. And he's most likely having to be there because this is the time of the Jewish Passover. The population of the city would be at its largest, more so than any other time of the year. And also for that very reason, and because of their fervor, the religious fervor that would also be magnified at this time of Passover, this would be the most likely place for an insurrection revolt to take place. And so his presence would be there, along with the 600 soldiers that would be choice soldiers, hand-picked soldiers, professional soldiers that would accompany him basically everywhere he would go. These would not be from the area of Jerusalem, nor would they necessarily be Latin or Italian. There might be a few true Roman citizen soldiers that were part of the army, maybe more so in the officers and so forth. But the largest constituency of that Roman cohort would probably be made up of Syrians. The Syrians were a neighboring country to Israel. They spoke Aramaic, which was the common language of the people of Israel at that day. The conversing language they spoke in was Aramaic, and the Syrians would speak Aramaic, and so they would be able to communicate better with them. The Jews never served as soldiers in the Roman army. They were given a special exemption by Caesar sometime in the past, allowing them not to serve as soldiers. But also, the very fact that that was part of the case, there was a greater amount of pressure placed upon the Jews in relationship to the soldiers. Since they didn't serve as soldiers, they were oftentimes incorporated in some of the more menial tasks that the soldiers had. For instance, it was a custom there, and I'm not sure it was a custom in all the nations that they had subdued, but I know it was in Israel, that a Roman soldier that would carry basically his supplies and so on and so forth with him, carrying a pack of sorts that could be very burdensome. Instead of him carrying it, by law, he was allowed to take off his free, regardless of what the person was doing, as long as they were of a certain age, between a certain age, between youth and elderly, they could take and mandate that that person would carry that pack for a space of 1 mile. And it didn't matter if you were at work, it didn't matter if you were in a business transaction, it didn't matter if you were on your way to a wedding. If they told you that you were going to stop whatever you were doing and carry their pack, you had to, by law, succumb to that and carry that pack with them for the length of that mile. They would literally mark off, the person carrying it would mark off the steps so that they would know when the mile was complete. And after that mile was complete, they would take and strip themselves of that pack, put it down, walk away, And that soldier could not compel them to go any further. But what they would normally do is they'd find the next person that was in the vicinity, and they'd get that person to carry it. So that was some of the things that they had to do, which caused them to basically chafe under the requirements that the Romans had placed them under. Remember, Jesus said, if a man compels you to go 1 mile, go with him 2. And that must have been just mind-blowing to the listeners there, especially when they were looking for a Messiah that was going to relieve them of all the rules and regulations and constrictions that the Romans had placed upon them. They were looking for a Messiah that was going to conquer all of their enemies and change this completely. And yet Jesus says, if somebody tells you to go 1 mile, I tell you to go with them 2. Now, what would be the benefit of going with that person that 2nd mile? 1st mile, you probably didn't say much of anything, right? But if you were a follower of Jesus and you were recalling what it was, now that 1st mile, you were probably aggravated, upset. You know, it was a burden to carry, plus you were probably involved in something that was more meaningful to you that you were taken away from. And you wouldn't be very happy. But imagine after you get to the end of that 1st mile and you're counting it, and then you remember, the Holy Spirit kicks in your remembrance that Jesus said, go with them 2. And about the time it comes for you to take it off, you look at that soldier and say, you know what? I'm going to go another mile with you. You might not have had much of a conversation with that soldier the 1st mile, but I guarantee you there was a conversation going on with that soldier the 2nd mile. And it was based on him looking at you like you're an idiot, asking, why in the world would you do that? And you sheepishly looking up and saying, well, I don't have any good reason other than the fact that I'm a follower of Jesus, and Jesus told me to love my enemies and do good to those who despitefully use you. And he specifically said, if there's a man who tells you to go 1 mile, go with him 2. So the 1st mile I had to out of compulsion. The 2nd mile I'm doing 2 out of the love for my Lord, and I'm demonstrating that love for you. And that would blow the socks off of that Roman soldier or his sandals, I suppose. Mm-hmm. What an avenue for witnessing to that Roman soldier. And secondly, what do you think that 2nd mile did to you? The 1st mile made you aggravated. The 2nd mile probably alleviated all that pressure and strain and frustration. It humbled you. Yeah. And you probably couldn't love that guy for the 1st mile, but you ended up loving him the 2nd mile. What a great object lesson.
And that's one of many illustrations in the Word, too, that what I believe we're going to see a lot of Roman soldiers in heaven.
Probably so. Probably so. And so these are the cohort. These are the ones. They are expert, more so than the average Roman soldier that would be put into police duty there, because for one reason they were guarding Pilate. Evidently, Pilate thought this was sufficient. What was happening with Jesus and what was happening in this situation was sufficient for him to take that cohort and literally put them at the disposal of the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. Why do you suppose that Pilate would want the whole 600 cohort to be there to carry out a crucifixion that was common? This was not an unusual experience for them. Remember, there were 2 other soldiers that were, 2 other thieves, 2 other criminals that were being executed that same day. Probably that was the schedule. And I doubt very seriously that cohort had been involved in the other executions. Why do you think that Pilate is putting the 600 there with Jesus?
This one isn't common to witness.
It's not common.
Extremely uncommon.
And there's still that question is whether or not the crowds are going to revolt, whether there's going to be a demonstration once the whole city becomes aware of what has finally happened and that Jesus, because of his popularity, and remember the Jews originally did not want this to happen during the Passover because they were afraid of the people and afraid of riots. And I suppose that Pilate was just as afraid. And also Pilate had just committed a criminal act himself. He had already decreed that I found no guilt in this man. I find no fault in this man. And yet this man has been sentenced to death. And he knows that that's not by law. That's by mob rule. Out of fear of the Jews themselves, he has succumbed to that. So all of this is causing Pilate to be a little more apprehensive and a little more fearful. And I'm sure that this large entourage of soldiers are there. Now, what has happened to Jesus just prior to this? The last paragraph of, or the preceding paragraph before this, starting in verse 24, we looked at this last week when Pilate saw that he was accomplishing nothing, but rather that a riot was starting. And the riot wasn't to get Jesus off the cross. The riot was because they were crying out to crucify Jesus. But a riot was starting. He took water and washed his hands in front of the crowd, saying, I am innocent of this man's blood. See to it yourself. And all the people said, his blood shall be on us and on our children. I desperately apologize to you guys for not being able to complete last week's Bible study. Out of almost 40 years of teaching and preaching, that's never happened to me ever before. So that was a first. I guess you guys should be privileged for that. You probably prayed, Lord, let's do something new tonight. And there it was. That was new. So I got sick, left, and y'all finished. And I didn't get to go through this with you last week. Did y'all cover any of this portion last week? About the fact that the people were actually saying, let his blood be on us and on our children. Mm-hmm. What an amazing statement that was. And
what a damning statement.
What a damning statement. Why
would you want to do that to your children, to think that you would put wickedness on your children and damn them in future generations when, no matter where you are, think about that you're damning your children.
Isn't it something that you use the word wickedness in demonstration of the children, and it's only because their wickedness against Jesus supersedes their care for their own children? That's how vile. They are so vile and wicked, they have no regard of what they are saying and pronouncing upon themselves.
And for the next 2,000 years, what that did to their children.
Absolutely.
They were so angry, though. They didn't even, like you said, they were so angry, they didn't even think about what they were saying.
That wickedness elevated, the wickedness against Christ elevated it to the point that nothing else in their lives was as dear as the destruction of this man who came to give his life for every one of them. Every one of them. His mercies and his grace. This, I have to tell you, is a depiction of man at his core. Don't think for a moment that this is exceptional. Do not think for a moment that these men that are representing all of these players at the cross are just exceptionally vile people. I honestly believe they are a microcosm of all of us. We dare not point our fingers at them saying, well, if I'd have been there, I wouldn't have acted that way. The fact of the matter is, if it wasn't for God's grace, we could all have fallen into that kind of depravity. If you recall again, and keep your hands there on Matthew 20:27, but go to Romans chapter 2.
And there was something else that was pointed out, Jonathan pointed it out too, even though, in the context and what they're literally saying is what we read, about his blood being upon us and our children, basically generations. What Jonathan pointed out too was that they didn't even realize that they were saying that's also their salvation, his blood from their children.
That's right.
The only way for any salvation is his blood.
Wow, what a great thought.
Yeah.
Never have heard that put in that context.
Yeah, because I thought about that for a while because the statement is so damning, so vile.
His blood be upon us and our children.
Yeah, and what they didn't even realize that even that blood was their salvation.
Their blood. And that's what we come to is the blood of Christ.
Yeah.
If you look not at Romans 2, but Romans 3, look at verse 9. And verse 9 says this, what then are we better than they? Not at all. Now, what is Paul saying? I know I'm throwing you right in the midst of a passage of Scripture. I haven't given you the background for it. Paul has just condemned all of humanity from chapter 1 all the way through chapter 3, showing that there is no one with excuse. No one has excuse. The ignorant do not have excuse. The moralist does not have excuse. The religionist does not have excuse. And he shows in great detail each and every avenue of their personality. And then he comes back to the Romans that he's writing to, the church of Rome, the godly, the believers that this letter is addressed to, and he asks them this question, what then? Are we better than they? Are we that are the saved? Are we better than those that were the pagans in chapter 1, the moralists in chapter 2, and the religious in chapter 2 and 3? Are we better than they? And that's what constituted our salvation. God just saw out of the sea of people here that there was a handful, a fraction of the population that he would save, that he would present the gospel to, that would come. And so sometimes I think we think we are. Sometimes I think we think that, well, you know, I grew up with a whole group of people that I was basically maybe one or two other persons in that group came to Christ. The rest of them had some horrible deaths and lives as a result of their choices. And, you know, it's tempting to think, well, yeah, but I had a better character. I had a better upbringing. I had a better parental experience. And so, you know, that's not the case. Are we better than they? Are we better? It says, not at all. Not at all. For we have already charged that both Jews and Greeks are all under sin, as it is written, there is none righteous, not even one. There is no one. There is none who understands. There is none who seeks for God. Don't think that we sought God till we found him. He sought us. He kind of made us think that we found him, but he found us. Remember when Philip came to Nathanael? Jesus found Philip, and then Philip goes to Nathanael and says, we found the Christ. To Philip, it was they found Christ. But to God's perspective, and by the way, his perspective is the only one that counts.
Yeah.
He found Philip. There is no one who seeks for God. All have turned aside. Together they have become useless. There is none who does good. There is not even one. Their throat is an open grave, and with their tongues they are deceiving. The poison of asp is under their lips, whose mouth is full of cursing and bitterness. Their feet are swift to shed blood. Destruction and misery are in their paths, and the path of peace they have not known. There is no fear of God before their eyes. The reason why all of those verses are capitalized is because those are various verses taken out of the Psalms, and I think possibly Isaiah, I'm not sure. But they're a compilation of verses found throughout the Old Testament describing humanity. And as you read through that, and as you read through what we just read about the cross, about the mockery there, about the belittling, about the scorn and insults that they hurl at him, you see this demonstrated in every one of their lives. And as I said, don't think that we're better than they. Remember this is a microcosm of all humanity. They're not people that were probably intent on doing this with their lives. They're probably not people that 10 years earlier saw themselves acting in any capacity in this nature. None of them that had served on the Sanhedrin would have thought that they would have basically disregarded every one of the laws and rules of judicial procedure to do what they did just hours before, but they did it. And they felt good about doing it. That's what's so sad about it. You know, you can say the same thing about those that were involved in the Holocaust, that there were different ones that were guards and different ones that were involved in the concentration camps. They witnessed everything. But some of these people had previously been school teachers and tailors and factory workers and people that had no interest in these things until they're propelled into it. And suddenly they find themselves, and in many cases, sadistically carrying out the commands that were given to them. And we think, who are these people? Were they the most evil people that the world has ever generated? Are they the most ungodly people? I want to tell you something. In this nation that we're living in now, there's the capacity of doing the same thing that any other cultural people has ever done at any time in history.
Still do it. We get people together in a group, and the group has this intention, and people still follow what the group is, and it's still the same thing. We still see it exactly the same. Whether you have intention to do that or not, it still comes up to be the same. It's sort of like when you get together with all your friends, kid growing up, you have no intention of doing it. Suddenly you're doing things that you go, what are we doing? You know,
if you're by yourself, you wouldn't be doing that.
You wouldn't be by yourself. So to me, it's still true and applicable for today.
Theologians used to speak, and there was a term that they coined. It's not a term that you find in the Bible, but it was a theological term, and it was referred to as the common grace of God. It's not the same thing as the saving grace. And what they were saying is that there are common graces that God gives to all humans. The very fact that a mother can have love for a child, the very fact that people can actually do good things for one another without being regenerated, isn't because that's their nature. It's because of the lone common graces God has placed within all humanity. Without those common graces, we could not exist. Those are God's graces on loan given to the most ungodly among us, so that we can demonstrate kindnesses and considerations. But don't think that that is something that originates within the mind and heart of man. That's something that is originated in the mind and heart of God, that God allows man to continue to enjoy. But it's also the kindness, the tolerance and the patience, the long sufferings of God, that as we have and enjoy those common graces, and yet those common graces do not turn us to him, then what it is doing is just storing up wrath for us. The more common grace that we have that we do nothing with in response to recognizing God, turning to God, honoring God, becomes even greater wrath that God has against all humanity. And one of the most common graces that God has given to humanity is the restraining of evil. The restraining of evil, that man, though he is depraved, doesn't necessarily, though we teach the depravity of man, we don't necessarily teach that man lives out that depravity fully. He has the capacity to do so, but because of God's common graces, it keeps man from acting out the depravity. There's something God's put within every man that's a common grace. It's called the conscience. And in many cases, that conscience is activated, but in some cases, that conscience can become seared. And so we have sociopaths and psychopaths that go beyond the norm. And every now and then we see elevated in our societies individuals that appear to be without any evil restraint. But thank God that's not the norm everywhere it is. But I believe that it's becoming more and more the norm the further and further we get away from God. It's almost as though in the last few decades we've seen in our country a slowly moving of the restraining work of God within our work, in our lives, because God uses many things to activate that restraining work. It's not just the conscience that he puts within us, it's also the word of God he surrounds us and influences by. And the more we're surrounded by the knowledge and nature of God, even though we're not serving God, knowing God, we're still influenced by that. And the more that diminishes, the less that common grace is demonstrated. Every nation on earth that has lived in the most pagan forms have carried out the most horrific treatments of humanity, one towards another. And also in paganism, you have the greatest and most vile immorality. Where a nation has been exposed to the word of God, the common graces of God, works as a greater restraint. He uses government to restrain evil. That's interesting because he put government into place to restrain evil from being as evil as it could be, even ungodly government. You know, as ungodly a government as Saddam Hussein had, yet it still restrained the measure of evil that is rampant over there in ISIS. You think about what has replaced the regime that was there is far worse than the regime that had been put there. And even ungodly government has to some effect. And when governments crumble, we start seeing that restraint starting to crumble. And then, of course, when we get to the tribulation period, and it says, he that restrains will be taken out of the way. I believe that is work of the Holy Spirit so that man will live out an unrestrained evil in that 7-year period of time, that what we think evil to be now and what we think evil to have been demonstrated in the past will be nothing in comparison to the evil that will be unleashed. And if you want to get a picture of what kind of evil I'm talking about, all you have to do is go back to the cross and see what kind of mercy and care and compassion that this world was offering the Son of God. And see how merciful they were in his needs. And you think about this. We're merciful to people that are undeserving of mercy. We've been taught, and we still do. Our culture still demonstrates a great deal of mercy to most ungodly. When we do have an execution in the Western world, it's generally carried out with the most humane treatment. In fact, one of the biggest debates over the last 20 years over execution is making sure that it's absolutely painless. And I mean, they've gone through every degree to injections and so on and so forth to make it as painless as can be. And so we're seeing, but what we're seeing in this, there is no mercy generated whatsoever. Even from the very fact, now of course we know that the motivation for that was because they did not want to be seen as the culprits. They wanted Christ dead, but they had much, I'm talking about the Sanhedrin, the ones that had decreed originally that he was worthy of death because of his blasphemy. Remember when they take him up to Pilate, and initially they tell Pilate, and Pilate says, well, go do with him what you want to. Basically, he's saying, I'll turn my eye away from it. I won't view it. I won't see it. I won't chasten you for anything. I won't punish you for doing it. It's fine, kill him. That's all. They had the permission to do so, but remember, they said no. But we have a law that, there is a law that we can't do this. Only Rome can do this. What they were doing was they were, for the sake of saving their face and making themselves to appear more innocent, were purposefully taking Jesus, who many of them secretly knew to be the Son of God, but refused to openly acknowledge him for fear of being cast out of the synagogue, and they loved the praise of men more than the praise of God. They refused to execute him under Jewish law, which would have been very much more humane and quickly, and insisted, we want him dead, but we want him dead by your hands, which would be to use the most vicious and horrific form of execution mankind has come up with, the crucifixion. Where's the mercy in that? Where is the recognition of their involvement in this to the extent that they would at least offer Jesus a more humane way of dying than what was being perpetrated, but for the sake of saving face, they want him to suffer. And the suffering was more than the crucifixion. As we go on, back in verse 25 of Matthew 27, it says, and all the people said, his blood be on us and on our children. Then he released Barabbas for them, but after having Jesus scourged, he handed him over to be crucified. Not much is said about it other than just after having Jesus scourged. Let me read to you out of John MacArthur's notes here on scourge. The whip used for scourging consisted of several strands of leather attached to a wooden handle. Each strand had a bit of metal or bone attached to the end. The victim was bound to a post by the wrist, high over his head, so that the flesh of the back would be taut. An expert at wielding the scourge could literally tear the flesh from the back, lacerating muscles and sometimes even exposing the kidneys or other internal organs. Scourging alone was fatal in some cases. That was the beating that preceded the crucifixion. This is not just an execution. This is a torture. Where'd you come up with that?
Did a quick search for scourge whips.
Wow. Can Josh see that as well?
Make it so we can see it.
Well, they even had it figured out that so many stripes will keep a man alive, but one more will kill him.
Actually, I did some research on that. That was the Jewish form of whippings. In the book of Deuteronomy, they were required, it was said they can, no whipping should be more than 40 stripes minus one.
39.
39 stripes.
And their lashes were smooth leather.
Yeah.
They had bone, pieces of bone.
And I have heard sermons preached. In fact, I even heard the sermon preached on by his stripes we are healed. And somebody came up with, there were 39 classifications of diseases, which that's not necessarily true, but that's what they came up with. And they said for every stripe that was on Jesus' back, there were one for every classification of disease. Well, that was not necessarily true. There are more than 39 classifications, but they fail to realize That would have been if he had been beaten by the Jews. The Romans had no such law. Sometimes, in fact, sometimes they would take turns. When somebody was exhausted from beating, someone else would take over and continue to beat the person. That's because it wore them out.
Well, and they also had people who were specially trained, and that's what they did. They had Roman soldiers that were in charge of crucifixion, and they trained.
And they probably knew when to let up so that the person wouldn't die and cheat them out of the glee of seeing the crucifixion take place. They wanted to make sure the person survived it, even though in some cases some didn't. But that was their, so this is not a merciful, compassionate crucifixion or execution that is taking place. Then we come to verse 27. Then the soldiers of the governor took Jesus into the praetorium and gathered the whole Roman cohort around him. They stripped him and put a scarlet robe on him. And after twisting together a crown of thorns, they put it on his head and a reed in his right hand. They knelt down before him and mocked him, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews." Now, Jesus is now taken into the praetorium. No Jews will be in there with him. Remember, they wouldn't go into the praetorium because they didn't want to be defiled so that they could partake of the Passover that night. Oh, Lord, we don't want to offend God by being defiled. So they took Jesus, and Jesus is now only with these Romans, these Roman soldiers. And they mock him and they ridicule him. And these are the ignorant wicked. Why do I say they're the ignorant wicked? Because from what I understand, and some of the commentators have shared, that these soldiers, because they would predominantly be with Pilate, were probably not from the area of Jerusalem. They probably were not as aware of the works and the teachings of Christ as other Roman soldiers would have been. And this is more foreign to them. They do not see him or recognize him in any way other than what they may have heard in recent days or even that particular day about him. And note, because the charge had been that he makes himself out to be a king, they go through this game that they are playing with Jesus being the butt of the game, and they begin to mock and ridicule the very fact that he could become the king. Says they, first of all, they stripped him naked. He had most likely had been stripped naked for the beating, and then clothed, and then that clothing that had been placed over those open wounds would be ripped off of him again, and that would cause those wounds to open up again. And then they took, and it says here, they put a scarlet robe on him. And in Mark's account and John's account, it says they put a purple robe on him. So is there a contradiction? This is scarlet, which is crimson or red, and the other is purple. And of course, we've often heard that purple is the color of royalty. And so what is it, a scarlet robe or is it a purple robe? Well, these are most likely the robes or the capes that the soldiers would have that would keep them warm, made of wool, and they were all crimson red. That was the color that Rome used. You've seen the movies, they're always dressed in red, and it really looks good on Technicolor. But what happens to a red garment when it's placed in the sun for any length of time? It begins to fade. And purple is not much further from red. It's not that far from red. And it would fade, and most likely it was a crimson scarlet garment that had been faded and was either faded in spots or faded entirely, so that Matthew says that it is a crimson or a scarlet robe. John and Mark say that it was a purple robe. But this they put on him, and if it is purple, it would be the color that the royalty would wear, the Roman royalty would wear as a demonstration, because purple was considered to be the color of royalty, and they put this on him for mocking, and they literally cloak him with this. I want you to go to Isaiah chapter 1. In Isaiah chapter 1, verse 18. One of my favorite verses in the Old Testament. It says, come now and let us reason together, says the Lord. Though your sins are as scarlet, they will be white as snow. Though they are red like crimson, they will be like wool. And how fitting it was that the crimson garment was placed on Christ, that is depicting of sin, that the garment that he bears, the sins of the world placed upon him, he would take the sins of the world. Come, let us reason together. Though your sins be as scarlet, they shall be white as snow. And so he is standing there. Notice that even in their mockery, ridicule, and humiliation of Jesus Christ, he still stands firm in the plan and purpose of God. It was God's plan that he would carry the sins of the world. When you look at Isaiah 53, look at this. It says in verse 4, surely our griefs he himself bore, and our sorrows he carried, yet we ourselves esteemed him stricken, smitten of God, and afflicted. But he was pierced through for our transgressions, he was crushed for our iniquities. The chastening of our well-being fell upon him, and by his scourging we are healed. All of us, like sheep, have gone astray, each of his own way. Each has turned his own way, but the Lord has caused the iniquity of us all to fall on him. Look at verse 10. But the Lord was pleased to crush him, putting him to grief. If he would render himself as a guilt offering, he will see his offspring and prolong his days, and the good pleasure of the Lord will prosper in his hand. I don't see how anybody can read Isaiah 53 and knows anything of the crucifixion of Jesus Christ without an awesome awareness of what that prophet had written hundreds of years before the birth and death of Jesus Christ. And so even though they are attempting their very best to humiliate him, placing that crimson robe on him was nothing but symbolism of the sins of the world being cloaked around him. They stripped him, put a scarlet robe on him, and they twisted together a crown of thorns. Some of the thorns, now we don't know, it doesn't say what the thorns were made of, but some of the thorns in Jerusalem, by the way, grow to be 12 inches long. Can you imagine a thorn like that? And they took and they made a crown out of it. Kind of like the wreath that they had seen on the coins of Rome that Caesar wore. They take and they mimic that wreath, that olive, isn't it olive wreath that is made of the leaves there that drape the head of Caesar, and they clasp a crown of thorns, pushing it down to certainly many of those thorns were bearing into his head. And it says, and they took a reed and put it in his right hand. This is his scepter. And they're mocking, and they knelt before him and mocking, saying, Hail, King of the Jews. They spat on him and took the reed and began to beat him on the head. After they had mocked him, they took the scarlet robe off of him. Now, by this time, that scarlet robe would have already started coagulating with his wounds in the blood, and again, they would freshly open up the pain of those wounds. As you know, did they take it off gingerly? Did they pull it easily, or did they gleefully do it with great pain and agony? And they put his own garments back on him and led him away to crucify him. These are ignorant men, no doubt about it, but they're in their ignorance, they're demonstrated their great capacity for evil and wickedness. Do not think that ignorance is a safeguard against judgment from God. Men in his ignorance still carry out their willful schemes. Verse 32. So they led him away to crucify him. Verse 32, and they were coming out. They found a man of Cyrene named Simon, whom they pressed into service to bear the cross. Not much is said about Simon, but if you go to Mark's account, in Mark chapter 15, it says this in verse 21. They pressed into service a passerby coming from the country of Simon of Cyrene. Cyrene is an area that is probably where Libya is today. It's in North Africa. He was a Jew living in North Africa that was in Jerusalem, quite possibly for the Passover. He's a passerby. He doesn't know what's going on. But it says they take him, and he says, Simon of Cyrene, and note this, the father of Alexander and Rufus, to bear his cross. Now, who in the world is Alexander and Rufus? They're the two children of Simon. So why does Mark put that in the account there? What purpose does that serve?
Identify him.
It identifies.
Yeah.
It's interesting. Mark is probably the Gospel of Peter. Most people don't realize this, but commentators, many of the solid commentators believe, because Mark became an assistant to Peter, and Peter's last days of ministry was in Rome, and Mark's Gospel is written to the Gentiles, and it is quite possibly this is the preachings and teachings of Peter, as Peter was preaching and teaching on the streets and in the churches there in Rome, about Jesus Christ, and Mark is the scribe that is writing down. So this is most likely the Gospel of Peter. When you look at Mark, it's interesting. And because it was from Rome, he is writing to Roman citizens, and when he puts in there the father of Rufus and who? Alexander and Rufus. It's quite possible that he's writing this down because these are two individuals that may very well be known among the church there in Rome. Remember, we studied about this a few weeks ago. We were talking about Malchus, the servant who Peter cut his ear off. It doesn't mention his name until you get to the book of John. And there it mentions it was Peter that cut his ear off, and it says that it was Malchus. And the reason is because church tradition tells us that Malchus was a notable church leader, later had become a follower of Jesus, quite possibly as a result of getting his ear put back on his head. And that when he writes in there, and this was Malchus, he's putting in his name so that the people there would say, oh, that's Malchus. Yeah, I've heard Malchus' testimony. He's talked about this, and that's what happened. If you go to Romans chapter 16, go to Romans chapter 16. And as Paul is writing his ending notes and he's giving his greetings at the end of the book, and he lists several people by name of the church in Rome. This is Romans 16. It's the last chapter of Romans, and he's concluding it. He's concluding it with talking about different people there that he wants to send his greetings to. He comes to verse 13. He says, greet Rufus, a choice man in the Lord, also his mother and mine. Now, he was not Paul's brother. This is not Paul's brother. When he's talking about greet Rufus and his mother, who is Rufus's mother and my mother, he's talking about the fact that at some point in time, Rufus's mother probably cared for Paul in one of his missionary journeys and probably assist him in some degree or another. And so he has a fondness for Rufus and his mother. Who is Rufus? Many people believe, many theologians believe that this is Rufus, the son of Simon the Cyrene, and that his mother was the wife of Simon the Cyrene. Now, this is a passerby. They pick him up from nowhere because Jesus is carrying his cross, and it is a heavy burden. And John MacArthur, in his notes, you'll read that some have suggested that it was broken down. He only carried the crossbeam, but there's no indication that that was the fact. Fact of the matter is, he probably carried the entire cross. It was extremely difficult for a man to carry, but much less a man who had just gone through the scourging that he had suffered. And so they compel, they're not going to carry it. There's no Roman going to carry this cross. And so they take someone who can. His name is Simon. He probably doesn't want to be there. He probably doesn't understand what's happening. He's a passerby. He just comes up on the scene, and before you know it, he is going there carrying the cross of Jesus. And I believe this probably was the avenue in which Simon became a believer, quite possibly. You can't be absolutely certain on these things. Church tradition says that that was the case. Many theologians attest to they believing that to be the case. And who knows? But wouldn't it be wonderful? Even in the midst of Jesus' agony, suffering, and humiliation, there is a man out of nowhere who comes. We see a centurion that is at the foot of the cross who pronounces Jesus Christ to be the Son of God. Surely this man must be the Son of God. I believe he is a believer. There's a thief that is next to Jesus that becomes a believer. And it wouldn't be out of place for God to take many of these players that have been playing part in the crucifixion of Christ, become believers in all that they see and all that they hear. So they bear him into service. It says in verse 33, and when they come to a place called Golgotha, which means a place of the skull, they gave him wine to drink, mixed with gall, and after tasting it, he was unwilling to drink it. Gall was made from a herb that was called myrrh. Remember, myrrh was part of the gifts that were given by the wise men when they visited Jesus. Gold, frankincense, and myrrh was mentioned there. There were 3 gifts given. It doesn't say that there were 3 kings. It just says 3 gifts. There might have been dozens of wise men that were doing this. And myrrh was a fragrance. It was also very bitter. In fact, the word myrrh, which is a word derivative of Mary, means bitter. And when it was made into a mixture and the oils were taken from it and it was consumed, it was a sedative. It would literally diminish a person. It would stupefy a person momentarily. And this was given them. Remember, we talked about that they had a law pertaining to the execution of Jews, that a mixture would be given to help sedate them before they would be stoned. That was a kindness to keep them from feeling the intensity of the pain of the stoning. Here is a mixture. Now, the Romans are giving this. At least it's implied here. Some have suggested it may be a group of Jewish women that have taken it upon themselves to provide this mixture. And it may be them that are giving it. But the reason why that it would be given to them is not because the Romans were interested in that person not feeling the pain. It was so that it would help subdue him so that they could literally crucify him. He would be less resistant if he was subdued in drinking this mixture of wine and myrrh, gall, and so that he would be easier to place on the cross. And it wouldn't be a long-lasting sedative. It would be a short-term. Jesus puts it to his mouth, tastes it, spits it out. He says he doesn't drink it. Why doesn't Jesus drink this mixture? Especially when you look in Proverbs chapter 31. Proverbs chapter 31, it says in verse 6, give strong drink to him who is perishing, and wine to him whose life is bitter. Let him drink and forget his poverty, and remember his trouble no more. And that may be why that there were a group of Jewish women that would make this mixture as so that they could be true Psalm 31 women and provide this sedative to the person who was perishing so it would be less painful for them to go through. But why didn't Jesus drink it? Why didn't Jesus partake of it? Why did he spit it out?
He wanted to be in full control of what he was doing.
He wanted nothing. He wanted no one to believe that he endured the cross because of something outside of himself that enabled him. As minor as that might be, he wanted everything to be absolutely certain that he endured the cross because he submitted to the Father's will. And he used nothing to his advantage. He felt everything. And do you think he resisted? Do you think that they needed to subdue him when they took those nails and they placed him in his hands? Note that verse 35, and when they had crucified him, that's all that they say. There's nothing more said about the crucifixion, the actual act of crucifying, other than when that he had been crucified. They passed by it so quickly. All the gospel writers passed by that so quickly. They do not tell about the driving of the nails. In fact, it's interesting that they do not speak of nails in any of the gospel accounts. It's not until we know that there were nails that were used until when he stands before Thomas, and Thomas said, unless I put my hands where the nails were, and his feet are in his hand, or in his hands, and his side that was pierced with the spear, well, I believe. And he said, and he showed Thomas his hands and his feet. And then, of course, when Peter is preaching and he says that Jesus was placed here by the foreknowledge of God, but ungodly men nailed him to a cross. Some have said, well, he was strapped to a cross, he was tied to a cross, but we know specifically the Bible says he was nailed to a cross. Now, it might have been a combination of both the ropes and the nails. There have been some debate over that, or maybe just the nails, depending on the head of that nail, whether or not it would hold the body, but he was fastened onto that cross with nails.
We had a guy when I was in high school. He was a physician who studied the crucifixion. He came into our church and gave us a view of the crucifixion from a perspective of a physician.
Right.
But the nails weren't pierced in his palm, because that wouldn't hold any weight at all.
Were they placed in his wrist?
They were placed in his wrist. Because the wrist, from this point on, above my fingers right here, that's the hand. The wrist is part of the hand. But when a nail is placed in here, it'll hold a lot of weight. That's where he said the nails were placed.
In the wrist.
In the wrist. Because up here, I mean, you can imagine there's nothing in the palm. Tear away. Just tear right slap through. He said, but here, and he also, you were talking about ropes and all. A lot of times they would rope the arms on the crossbeam, put a rope across this part of the arm to help hold the weight of the body. But for the most excruciating pain,
they would not,
and for the most vilest of whoever they were killing, they wouldn't do that.
so that all the weight would be on that.
Would be on that. And of course, in the feet were nailed, lapped over. One nail went through both feet. That had to be a pretty good sized nail to do that here. But it necessarily didn't have to be in the ankles, because on the feet, because the feet were only used to push the weight up. In other words, he went through, man, I tell you, it was so hard to listen.
Yeah.
And as a high schooler, I got a lot of it. I still remember part of it. He said, for a person to last on the cross, for them to gain any breath at all, they had to push with their legs up in order to gain any volume in the lungs. Of course, when you did that, of course, pain shot through your feet and all through your legs and everything else. And then, because of that pain, you let go. Then the pain came into the hands again. So it was very crucial.
There's a question. Why isn't the Bible more explicit in the details of the crucifixion and the scourging, other than just say he was scourged, other than just say he was crucified? Why doesn't the Bible go into more detail and explain what you just said and give us a more vivid, more horrific view of the physical pain and torture of Christ during the crucifixion?
I don't know. I mean, I've heard people, this movie that came out that showed probably the crucifixion most vividly than any.
Right.
I've never seen it. Don't want to see it necessarily. But it was very vivid. But I'm wondering if we're not supposed to key in on them. I mean, I know Christ went through the pain for us, but that's not what we're doing.
That's not the key.
That's not
the physical pain. It's the spiritual.
It's the spiritual aspect.
And as bad and as horrific as the physical was, that's what we see. What he knew, what God saw, and what he experienced from the wrath of God and the spiritual aspects, that was the drinking of the cup. Sure, no doubt that it was just as distasteful, the physical elements of the cross. But I believe the grieving that Christ went through in Gethsemane was on the spiritual elements primarily.
Well, like you taught us before that, the first half of the crucifixion was the wrath of man, and then the last half the wrath of God. And as bad as that was, the wrath of God was worse.
And you think about this, why is God allowing such horrific wrath to be demonstrated, especially at the object of his son by humanity, if all that was required was just his death? Why? And I have to believe this is the greatest indictment against all humanity that God has. Think of this. When we've studied the tribulation, when we've studied when Christ comes back at the end of the tribulation, and he brings down his judgment on this world, or at the time of the great white throne judgment at the end of the ages, at the end of the 1,000-year millennium, when God finally brings forth every man, the one thing that is absent at the time of his coming and at the time of the great white throne judgment is mercy. There is absolutely no mercy given by God at that time. There is no mercy.
Well, you've taught us, and you brought it out in several lessons. I think the reason why, what I'm trying to say is that this was an example of the cruelness of humanity.
Yes.
It's the very essence of the cruelness of humanity. And that's why we see all of this. I don't think it has to go through the details, but that's why it's there.
Well, what do you suppose, though? There's no evidence of mercy. There's no sign of mercy. There's no mercy given. But do you think that keeps people at the time of the great white throne judgment from pleading for mercy? No. Do you think the plea of mercy will be there? Do you think the cry of mercy will be there?
Guaranteed.
Do you think that there will be any person that goes through the portals into that lake of fire that will not ask for mercy? And what will God's response be? It will be the cross. Where was the mercy of man on the only one who deserved mercy? Where was man when he was at the place when God was submitting to his judgment? Where was man when the man who deserved all mercy, did he get any mercy? Do you see any mercy at all being perpetrated by these actors on crucifixion? It's with absence of mercy. God, like I said, this isn't a select group of people that are unique and that we wouldn't be that way. This is a microcosm of all of us. the capacity for sin, just because we haven't been that evil, just because we haven't come close to that evil. Don't think without the unregenerative work of the Holy Spirit, we didn't have the capacity to be that evil.
And I don't know if y'all noticed about there are things coming on TV now that are made so unreal in showing the capacity of evil and wickedness and what people do to other people. I mean, think about the shows that are coming on. I can name a few, but I try to stay away from all of them.
Yeah.
Well, and how would be just such a flip-flop in the kingdom. When you look at even in the animal world, you know, how vicious and cruel it is in the animal world too. I mean, absolutely vicious. I mean, vicious beyond anything.
Have you ever seen a bird attack a worm? A bird, a little blue bird, is about the most vicious creature I've ever seen. They don't show any mercy.